Last week, we sort of introduced the idea that within this broader discussion that Paul's having with the Corinthians about how grace transforms not just the individual, but whole communities of people, he begins to address some pretty sensitive personal issues and personal areas at the very least. And so these were areas that the people of Corinth were pretty confused about. And it was mostly because of the culture that they lived within. So the most basic assumptions about who they were as a person and who God is and what it means to have a body and how they should live their lives, they had all these things all twisted up inside of them. And so we also may not think specifically about these particular questions very often, but we do have our ideas. And whatever culture that we're in, it reinforces those ideas in various ways. But the gospel is starting to take root in Corinth here, and this is clearly a place where these assumptions are totally jacked up and nowhere near what the biblical assumptions would be. So as we've moved into chapters 5 through 11, Paul's dealing with these very practical issues that these people are facing inside their Christian community. And so last week, we specifically went through Paul's discussion on sexual morality, but we did it in a pretty general sense. And we're going to recap a couple of points from that discussion this morning because it bears a little bit on the discussion that we're going to get into today. So we're essentially in the first part of chapter 7 today, and this morning the specific talk is about sex and marriage. And so next week we talk about sex and not married or no longer married. And so in that discussion next week, we get into divorce and remarriage and all kinds of stuff. And so over those 3 weeks of discussions, there's really not a single person whose life doesn't fall under the lens of the discussion that Paul's having here. And so this is a brief look at where we were last week. These are the 4 questions about sex that came primarily out of 1 Corinthians 6, 12 through 20. And, you know, there Paul is saying that if we're going to have a meaningful conversation about sex, we have to begin with the issue of identity. And his point with that is that the things that we do and the things that are important to us as people, we're going to have to look at those things, and we're going to have to ask ourselves just how essential they are and what role they play in who we are. And how we answer that question will determine, like, the whole thing about what we do in any given situation. All right, so for instance, this area of sexuality and how it relates to our identity is kind of an obsession in the world that we live in today. How does your sexuality relate to who you are? And in our culture, this pretty much gets right to the heart of what it means to be desired and what it means to be acceptable. And as a culture, we really identify our sexuality as the heart of who we are. Right? And that means that people are, very neurotic about how other people view them from a sexual standpoint. Okay, are you being desired? Do you look the way that you're supposed to look in order to be attractive or whatever? Okay, we have multi-billion-dollar daily preoccupations with this stuff. Okay, we're putting a weight onto our shoulders in terms of our identity in this area of sexuality that the Bible just doesn't put there. And it really matters that we see this, because if we're going to talk about sex and its place in human matters within the context of marriage, then we first have to really understand who we are. And Paul is saying that you are not defined by your sexual activity. he says that some of you were this way, but you were washed and made right with God. You're a child of God. All right, so that is where we get who we are, and then that gives us a basis for knowing if we're acceptable. Okay, and of course we're acceptable. The most important voice in the universe accepts me. How could I not be desirable if the God of the universe manifested himself in human flesh and died as a substitute for my sins? Okay, I matter to him. He desires a relationship with me. So as Christians, we have these very key issues of identity kind of nailed down, or we're supposed to. And the idea is that the sexual aspect of who we are does fit in, but not as the controlling or driving force in our lives. And so we're going to see today that it is as a way of communicating with another person on the most intimate level. And so we also talked last week about the question of spirituality and sex. And so this is another thing that's going to come into sharper focus this morning, I think. What is the relationship between the body and the soul? Right? The question is kind of, can we do anything that we want with our bodies and just believe that it has no bearing at all on our spiritual life or on our soul? And the scriptures teach that we are an integration of body and soul or spirit. And what we do in every element of our lives has an effect on the whole of who we are, which means that sex does have spiritual implications. So then the moral question that Paul raises in this passage is whether sex is in the realm of taste or is it in the realm of ethics? Is sex in the same realm as choosing what kind of car you're going to drive? Or because of its high level of significance, is sex solidly in the realm of things that have ethical value? Is there right and wrong related to sexual practices? And Paul is arguing that because sex is such a big deal, it does have ethical significance. Sex should be protected by ethical judgments. And then last, there was the relationship of sex to the community. Okay, and the question was, is sex a purely private matter? And the obvious point that may need to be made again in looking at our society a little bit is that the act of sex should probably be a private matter. Okay, but the effects of sex are actually quite public. Okay, it doesn't just affect the lives of the people involved. It affects many other lives as well. And so the lives of children and other family members are often very affected by sexual decisions. So that's exactly why Paul's so concerned that this Christian community in Corinth not have the twisted views towards sex that the rest of the city's culture did have. And so that's a basic recap of where we ended up last week. And so we're going to integrate some of those ideas into Paul's discussion on sex and marriage, because that's exactly what Paul does. So here that is. This is verse 1 of chapter 7. It says, "Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have relations with a woman." And so it seems pretty clear that this letter contains answers to questions that they were asking him. All right, so that's what he's talking about when he says here, "Now for the matters you wrote about." All right, so this happens like 4 more times between here and chapter 12, where he prefaces what he says by indicating that he's answering questions that they've already asked him. And it sure looks like the very first thing that was on their mind to ask him about was sex. So here's Paul's first answer to their questions. All right, so this is addressing the theory that was out there in the church of Corinth that it was good for a man not to have relations with a woman. And so this notion seems to be a reaction by the Corinthian church against the excesses that were part of their culture and even a part of their church. And that means that, that shouldn't have gone quite yet, okay? That just means that there's significant confusion inside this church about what's right and what's wrong. So now we can switch it. The present distress that Paul calls this in verse 26 has to do with sexuality. Okay, and it is distressing. There are people that are going around saying that the body and the spirit are completely disconnected, so you can do whatever you want with your body. We talked about that some last week. They were making the argument that food is for the stomach and the stomach is for food, right? So if you have urges, then you should satisfy those urges. That's just the way we're designed and the way that things work. Okay, so there were other people that were saying that the body can be this huge distraction from a proper life of the spirit. So it's better that you do not indulge in the desires of the flesh because that can interfere with the focus of your spiritual life. Takes your eyes off of God and puts them on things that are of this world. And so this particular attitude has, unfortunately, had a significant role in the history of the Western church. All right, this idea is, though, very far removed from the biblical point of view. All right, but this particular idea is creating this stir within the church in Corinth. There are even questions about whether or not they should have sex with their spouse. Okay, they were even asking if they should stay married to their spouse. Okay, are these things wrong? All right, these are questions that are kind of up in the air for these people. And so that's why Paul has to address this thing. And as a reaction to church people telling them that they shouldn't have sex with their wives, these guys are deciding to go out and find themselves a prostitute. And within the Greco-Roman cultural framework, this is a perfectly acceptable solution. Okay, some of these people were advocating celibacy inside of marriage, where the relationship was purely platonic. Okay, we're going to talk about that more in a minute. And other people were saying that as Christians, they should ditch the entire idea of marriage and even just get divorced. So trying to imagine being a part of this really large group of Christians that had no consensus on these points about sex or marriage. And how well do you think that you would all get along? Okay, there were divisions in marriages and disputes between friends and family members. This was kind of a disaster. All right, it really was. And so the group that Paul's addressing here is a complete disaster. And Paul's answer goes like this. Okay, these are complicated circumstances. Paul's able to see, though, and communicate that there are absolutes in these areas that need to be addressed here, okay? There is right and wrong. There is God's way, and there is the way that is not God's way. But because of the complex nature of some of these decisions that some of these people are having to make, Paul's able to say that God just hasn't spoken with clarity to every particular circumstance. And that makes this a pretty interesting discussion. Okay, I can see a real authenticity to this letter. there are answers that Paul just doesn't have with certainty. And so on one hand, he's able to say in verse 6 that he gives this advice as a concession, not as a command. And what he means is that the thing that he's talking about here is something that he can't really say that it must be this way, because there just isn't the background available in what God has said to make that determination. And then in verse 10, he says that I give instructions. Okay, not I, but the Lord. And now what he's saying is that the thing he's about to say is not his opinion. God has spoken in this particular area. Then verse 12 says, I say, not the Lord. And again, we're looking at a limit to what God has said about the sexual relationship in terms of the circumstances that some of these people were facing. Paul doesn't presume to be speaking on God's behalf. I am going to give you my opinion. He makes it super clear again in verse 25. And so the reason that I'm making this point is that there's a lot of confusion in some of these areas. And that's probably because there is some ambiguity, all right, in these areas of sexuality. But in the subject that we're going to talk about this morning, not so much. All right, so Paul and the Bible take a pretty clear stance on the subject of sex and marriage. All right, Paul's very clear on what is appropriate and what is right in this area. That was cool. So verse 2 says, but because of the instances of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. So here he's establishing a principle here that's part of God's design for marriage, that marriage is intended to include a sexual relationship. And because it includes a sexual relationship by design, he goes on to say that will make, what he's going to say is going to make up the bulk of this morning's conversation about this. So the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. So Paul just made a super profound statement, and we need to be a little bit careful that we unpack this inside of the historical context that it was said within. All right, so we're going to look at this situation of what sex is and what it means within marriage. And the situation that Paul is speaking into is the idea that the Greco-Romans had of marriage. Okay, marriage meant something, and sex within marriage meant something that's very different from what it does to us in, 21st century America. And so for most Greco-Romans, marriage was pretty much thought of as a merger. It was a way of maintaining or increasing social status. And so you would marry someone who was your social equal, or if you were super lucky, you would marry, like I did, someone that was above your social station. Okay, and so there are just obvious economic and social benefits to this. But it also meant that when you had children, you would pass on your name and your social standing and your economic potential. Okay, these things were all very important to the Greco-Romans, and so these are also very important things today in many places in the world. Okay, many people in the world still do not get married because they have found the one. All right, they get married because it's a good arrangement for themselves or for their family. Okay, these are the kinds of things that are being considered by these people when they marry someone. And as a consequence, sex within marriage takes on a very particular kind of role. Okay, so the Romans viewed sex as just erotic pleasure. And so in their writings and in their poetry and in really all of their cultural thinking, this is pretty clear. Okay, there is a total disconnect by their very definition between pleasure and duty. And so as a married person, you have duties. A husband and a wife have duties to one another. In a Greco-Roman marriage, there was a kind of contractual idea to the marriage. So to the Romans and to the Greeks before them, the idea that you have responsibilities in marriage is what makes the marriage even possible. But when you start talking about the duties or the obligations that you have within the context of marriage, it would be impossible for them to imagine that you could also talk about pleasure. Okay, for them, pleasure was the kind of thing that didn't have any strings attached. Okay, pleasure is something that you do because you want to, not because you have to, or even because you should. You get that? You understand that this would have been really hard for them to get their heads around. So this is the cultural consensus that Paul's speaking into. This is the outlook that the people had. All of their views about sex and marriage were shaped within this kind of understanding. And that means that for them, if you were a man with means, you would just find yourself a mistress that could satisfy your sexual desires. And then you would go home to your wife, whom you were building a corporate identity with. Okay, but most people didn't really have that kind of economic latitude, so they would just go down to the local temple and have sexual relationships with the temple prostitutes. Okay, and Corinth was well known around the ancient world for the worship that went on in its temples. Okay, so that's the practice and the mentality that's going on in this culture and within this church as Paul writes this letter to the Corinthians. And in that context, Paul starts to paint a picture of the Bible's very radical message about relationship and about how sex and marriage are tied together. All right, so this is a radical message to Paul's audience. And I think that if we listen carefully, it's also a radical message for us. Okay, so I think that what he's saying is really amazing, and I think that it has amazing implications in our own lives. In chapter 6, verse 16, Paul has already laid out the definition for marriage. Okay, it's exactly what Genesis 2:18 says that it is in marriage, to become one flesh. Okay, within the sexual union inside of marriage, two individual persons do join together physically and also as persons. Okay, ultimately that's what marriage is for. And it's because of that that the idea of sex inside of marriage changes from what the Corinthians were thinking. Okay, there are implications to this idea of two becoming one, just as there were implications to the Greco-Roman view of marriage. Okay, that was just like a corporate merger. Okay, if the whole meaning of marriage is that two independent lives join together and become one life, then the sexual relationship fits also within that framework. Okay, that means that sex within the context of marriage becomes serving our spouse as a whole person to a whole person. Okay, so that's what sex is about in marriage. It's serving as a whole person, not just what you can do functionally, not just how you can be relationally and conversationally. not just how you can serve intellectually, it's also serving with your body to the entire breadth of who the other person is. Okay, from the biblical view, sex is a practice that creates an intimate bond between two people. Okay, when we have a sexual union, there is a union emotionally. Okay, sex is supposed to be an emotional experience. There's a union psychologically. Okay, there's a connection that's physical, as two bodies are quite literally becoming part of one another. All right, it's intended to distill and continue to cultivate a deep, holistic unity that's God's design for the marriage relationship. All right, and this part here is an important part of this package. Sex is described biblically as a giving of yourself to the other person. All right, now in the context of sex, giving yourself to another has certain rewards. All right, but there is nonetheless an act of giving, and that's an important point. Okay, when we talk about sex, we almost never phrase things as giving sex. Okay, we talk about what we are getting or having. All right, and that is so messed up. Okay, we have the exact same mindset about this that the Greco-Roman people had. And we think that this is all about my pleasure. Now, make no mistake, sex is pleasurable, but at its heart, it is a giving of your body to another person. And with that comes an access to one another and a vulnerability and an openness to each other that's just not possible with any other kind of relating. Okay, it's an intimate bond of two persons becoming one. And it is the greatest human picture of what it means to be in the image of God. Okay, it's the fellowship of separate persons being together in one essence. Okay, so there is something very profound about eros or erotic love. Okay, especially when it's not divorced from agape love or the selfless love that is the love of God. So these two things are symbiotic. They work together because we are whole people. And so it's as we seek intimate bonds with our spouse and as we open our lives to each other and open our bodies to each other and practice this kind of total vulnerability with one another that we're able to give. And then, as it becomes true that the other person has made themselves totally vulnerable to us, we're able to serve them. So that's the biblical view of sex within the framework of marriage. Now, sex also communicates total acceptance. Okay, we're really saying that we accept the other person. We embrace them. It communicates a total commitment. Okay, pretty much all things are put to the side, and I am focused entirely on this other person. Okay, we're talking about a delight in our spouse. Okay, and it's, these are the things that just really help to distill a beautiful partnership that's God's intent for a marriage relationship. And if that's the case, then you can see why Paul would be pulling out whatever hair he had left as the Corinthians are just walking away from this beautiful thing. Okay, some of them were married and still saying that since they were so spiritual, they weren't that into sex. Okay, and Paul's trying to communicate here that they just don't understand what this whole sex thing is about. And if that's what sex is for in the framework of marriage, then there are implications for our spouses and for ourselves as spouses. Okay, so Paul highlights two of them here. He says the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. So that's language that has to do with morality. Okay, he's saying something that is completely out of character for the culture that he's speaking into, and he's saying that men have an obligation to their wives in the area of sex, and likewise the women to their husbands. There are sexual responsibilities. Okay, there's a choice for us to make. And as Christians, we make that choice because we are desiring to serve the other person and to distill in the deepest and most intimate way the partnership that God has brought together within our marriage. Okay, so there are responsibilities sexually to one another and with one another within the context of marriage. So it's even more profound that verse 4 says the wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. So Paul clearly understands that a marriage is a union of two equals. Okay, he's not a misogynist, regardless of what various sources may say. The body that we possess inside of marriage is not just our own. Okay, when we enter into a marriage relationship, we surrender autonomy. Okay, we surrender the rights to be the sole chooser of what happens with our bodies. Okay, we don't simply make our bodies available to the other person, but we use our bodies to move toward our spouse. Okay, as a responsibility, as a duty, we surrender our freedom. Okay, my body is yours and your body is mine. All right, so we're starting to tread here on pretty shaky ground. Okay, it's starting to sound like it's getting a little risky. And if you look at the history of most cultures in the world, they understand part of this. And getting just part of this makes a terrible mess. So we often seem to understand the part where the wife's body belongs to the husband. Okay, that's just true. Okay, most cultures have been misogynistic and patriarchal, but Paul is saying something here that is culturally revolutionary. He's saying that the husband doesn't have the rights to his own body, just exactly as the wife does not. And this is consistent with Paul's views of marriage as mutually submitted equals. So Paul's describing the sexual relationship as a very high risk, very high reward endeavor within the context of marriage. Okay? It's high risk and high reward for both parties. And it's risky because we surrender the autonomy of our body to another person. And therefore, we can be used. Okay, you're entrusting yourself to another who is fallen and distorted and a self-interested human being. And inside of a culture that has no foundation at all for what we're describing here, where people are completely committed to my rights and it is my body, there is no basis for real trust in the relationship. Okay, and the assumptions that are there inside of a secular culture, I'm not sure you'll ever get beyond the "it's my body" part of this discussion. Okay, it's uniquely within the biblical framework that we can talk about bodies not being the object of being used or being exploited, but as something that's truly beautiful and something that is for surrendering to another person. Okay, this is very risky if we don't have the right foundation and if we don't apply this to all the parties involved. Okay, and I know that many people, many of us here have come into our marriage relationships with having had our intimate trust already violated by some other person. Okay, maybe it was as a child, maybe it was as an adult, maybe we've been married before and, we're out of that relationship, but it messed us up. And a great many of us are deeply broken right in this spot, right here, where we're talking about. And in the present, our marriages are reverberating with the pain that we experience because God's design for our sexual lives has been violated. Right, either by our own choosing or sometimes by the work of somebody else. So there are consequences for our sexual choices or our sexual histories. And this then becomes an even higher risk endeavor, okay, to give yourself over as we're talking about here. All right, so also understand that any instructions or principles that come through me from this passage is addressed to like a standard level of brokenness, okay, that's true of the collective. If you have special trauma in this area, then nobody is telling you that you should be doing anything, okay? If that's the case for you, then all I want to communicate is that God loves you and wants to heal your pain. All right, but your healing may come through, applying the standard pressure that this particular passage applies, but it may not. And you may benefit from interacting with someone who has a biblical worldview and also special training and care in this area. And so the question that many of us may need to address is, what does it require as believers in Jesus Christ to have a high-risk, high-reward sexual relationship with our spouse, okay, and with our spouse's body? How can we build the kind of trust that we need in order to be able to experience sex as God describes it? And the answer to that has to do with me actually having the capacity to put your needs and your interests above my own in the most intimate way. Okay, if we don't have that capacity, then our marriages will fail. Okay, you may stay together as a legal contract or as some sort of partnership, but your marriage and the experience that God has in mind for you will be deeply diminished in terms of your experience of its design. Okay, this really is getting at the idea of coming at this thing with the idea of, what do I have to give in my marriage? All right, so maybe you've been married for a while and you're sensing that the walls are closing in on the relationship and you feel like a sense of desperation about where things could go from where they are. And the idea that I would want to insert into here is that the thing that you're really calling out for is God in your life. Okay, the thing that's really getting to you is the awareness that you don't have what it takes. And honestly, that's just not a surprise to God. Because to love in a selfless way requires that we have the core of our own needs met first. And it's on the basis of that that we can move toward and, meet the needs of another person. So that means that it is in the coming alive to God, spiritually, through receiving Christ's sacrifice on the cross on behalf of our own guilt before God, that we're able to have access to resources that are just beyond our own capacities. And in a way that transcends the limitations of our own brokenness. Okay, and we can serve and we can reach beyond ourselves to the real needs and the interests of that other person. Okay, so really this is an opportunity for you to recognize that what God has for your life and what you are able to make for your life apart from God could not really be any more different. Okay, they're radically different from each other. God wants for you to have a deep and satisfying and fulfilling life and marriage. Okay, He's the author of those things. As the author of the sexual relationship, He's the only one that can bring us to that place. And He's offering, on the basis of His grace and on the basis of His mercy, for us to be reconciled to Him and to have Him take residence in our life and to give us the capacity to transcend ourselves for the sake of another person. All right, it's a really beautiful thing. So in drawing things to a close, Paul says in verse 5, do not deprive each other, unless perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Okay, so Paul's saying here that in a theoretical sense, all right, it could maybe be argued that for a short period of time and for the sake of your very busy prayer life, there could be a temporary exception to what he's saying here. All right, but the norm is to not deprive each other. Right? So we're going to wrap this up with talking about this idea. So sex is kind of interesting in this way. An active sex life is no barometer of a healthy marriage. All right? It's part of a healthy marriage, but it's not a barometer of a healthy marriage. All right? But the absence of an active sexual life is diagnostic. So that's actually something that we may need to talk about for a second. If we're saying that we're not that interested in serving our spouse physically because what we're really interested in is serving Christ, then what Paul's saying here is that, you're just blowing smoke, man. That's not an excuse. Paul and the scriptures are not dualistic at all about this. They're not saying that you serve God at the expense of serving your spouse in this way. Okay, that's not how this works. Okay, then there are couples that are really having difficulty in their marriage over one of the couple, having a desire to follow Christ. And, sometimes when people feel their spouse resisting the thought of moving toward Christ with their life, they feel distant from them. Okay, they crave a unity in this area, and that unity is being deprived from them, and as a result, they keep the sexual relationship at a distance also. Okay, and so that's also exactly the opposite of helpful when unity is the object of the game. All right, so this kind of thing alienates people. It communicates that, until you get your crap together with God, then I'm not that interested in you. Okay, Peter said just the opposite thing. Okay, 1 Peter 3, he said, it's due to the chaste and respectful behavior of the wife that a non-believing spouse is often won. So it's not right to use sex to punish or to use it as a tool to get the other person to do what we want or to manipulate people spiritually, okay, or at all. So it's counter to the point of sex inside of marriage to use it to communicate that someone is not acceptable until they become acceptable by doing what I think that you should do. Okay, so emotional closeness and sex is also an issue that we may need to look at. Men and women tend to be different in this area, okay? Some of us relate in a primarily functional way, okay? I'm this way. I think that it's fair to say, believe it or not, that my wife also is primarily a functional relator. we both just function. Okay, we do the things that need to be done. And that means that it becomes kind of easy to minimize the emotional or the intimate parts of marriage. Okay, so some of us are like that. Some of us are preoccupied and distracted with lots of different concerns. Okay, lots of weighty things are vying for our attention. We have lots of different plates spinning, and in our own minds and hearts, this is why we're not moving towards our spouse, and we're not responding to them moving towards us. Okay, we're ignoring the building of that close and intimate physical connection that's a vital part of a healthy marriage. Okay, so a lack of an active sexual life inside of a marriage would indicate that you've probably got some problems or in one of these areas or maybe another. And so you may need to think about how you're relating to each other within the broader framework of your married life. All right, so then there's just the obvious difference in the way that most men and most women think about sex. I do hope that you realize that it's just different. Okay, for men, sex is often like a catalyst for closeness. Okay, if you want to feel close to your wife, then what are you really thinking about? All right, and so after experiencing the sexual union, you do feel close to your wife, right? So that's the way it works. That's just the way it is if you're a guy. Sex is a way to instigate feeling close. But most of the time, the ladies do not think in those kinds of terms. It's usually just the other way around. So the interest in sexual connection with your dude emerges out of a feeling of closeness that comes before the act. Okay, so for one of us, sex is generally an outgrowth of closeness, and for the other, it's generally a catalyst for closeness. We just come at it from kind of different angles. And you're going to have to figure that one out on your own inside of marriage. All right. So there's also the reality that if you notice your spouse getting into bed and you just decide to like play possum or whatever, right? You kind of pretend to be asleep. Then maybe what you're really saying is that, you don't feel close to them. And you're holding a grudge against them. Okay? You got problems with them, and there's unresolved conflict in your heart. Okay, so the issue of sex is really going to bring some of these things out in the open, where you're going to have to deal with them. And with God as the center of the marriage, there really is a context for getting at these things and behaving in ways that can heal. Okay, a marriage that's broken or even in the process of being broken, can be healed. So I think that the important point this morning is this really extraordinarily beautiful picture of the Bible's view of sex. Okay, so God gave us sex inside of marriage to express unity and to create unity. It's this incredible picture of what it can be like to be in union with another spirit. And we should be actively moving towards sex inside of marriage, because marriage is all about expressing the unity that we were all created to desire most, but that we don't possess as individuals. Okay, we're acceptable to God. We are desired by God. And based on that alone, all of our spouses should feel that they are acceptable to us and desired by us. All right, and God gave us the perfect way to express that to them. Okay, so next week, talk about sex again, but the subject is going to be sex outside the confines of marriage and the damage that it does to your ability to experience God's design. For sex inside of marriage, right? And also some of the other things about being single and the subject of sex. So that's all I have for this morning. That was fun.